Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another screencast with your teacher, Mr. Stano. And today we're going to talk about ocean pollution. Much like lakes and our freshwater sources, the oceans are going to still suffer from the same types of source, or potentially same types of source and non-point sources of pollution. How it's handled is a little bit differently, and there are some other issues that we need to look at. Oceans, if we can monitor or basically maintain certain levels of pollutants or maybe contaminants to go into it, they may be able to degrade over time or dilute enough where they're not going to pose any issues. The problem becomes is when we either have huge point sources of pollution, such as maybe an oil spill, or we have certain types of industry or agriculture continually inputting large amounts of contaminants that system becomes out of balance. And no matter what we can do, they're going to pose a threat to us, either health-wise or ecologically. These are just a number of different sources of types of pollutants, point or non-point sources, and some effects because of that may end up affecting our ocean zones. And we can see here that we have, let's take a look, cities with toxic metals and off from streets, parking lots. We have runoff from those that can make its way into our water supplies. Bacteria and viruses from sewer systems or treatment plants may also get in and out into our water supplies. One of our biggest things, though, is going to be looking at some of these nutrients that make their way in, and then they're going to be affecting shellfish beds. Remember, these are filter feeders, and as these feeders take in any of these contaminants, they could potentially be closed down, and we do experience this from time to time on Long Island. Runoff from farms and pesticides containing nitrates and phosphates are going to have these algae blooms, which are going to create our dead zones. And we have seen in the past fish going into these dead zones, don't know what they're in for and end up dying. Red tides also associated with these algae blooms too. So there's a lot that's definitely going on. Whatever it is, either as a runoff type issue or a direct or a point source of pollution, it's going to have an effect ecologically on our oceans, whether it's going to be these algae blooms, shellfish beds closing, or any other viruses that might be coming into our beaches that may have to get ultimately shut down. But I'd be familiar with each of the type of the ways that can go in, and we'll talk about them a little bit more in class 2. So we have these harmful algae blooms, which are caused by an explosive growth of algae. It can be associated with runoff agriculturally, road runoff, or from sewage itself, as sewage treatment plants discharge into bays and oceans. Ultimately, these can cause red tides, brown tides, depending on the type of the algae that is blooming in that area. We see this in with the Mississippi River, with a huge amount of agriculture going on there, discharging into the Gulf of Mexico, forming a huge seasonal dead zone in that area. And this is what you can see in this picture. Basically, as this drainage basin, or this huge watershed right here, all ends up going through the Mississippi, out through Louisiana, forming a dead zone in that region. Once again, pretty warm temperatures too, is really kind of helps with this a lot, and we get those dead zones. Something we have to be careful of. Chesapeake Bay, a similar issue with the dead zones there, or with low oxygen concentrations, but the pollution from the surrounding areas being in the northeast here, you have a huge amount of pollution ending up in this drainage basin, causing problems with the Chesapeake Bay estuary there, just not able to keep up with it. Ocean oil pollution is another issue, whether it's tankers into it or refineries along coastlines. What we've seen is that crude oil can be cleaned up naturally a little bit quicker. With the BP oil spill, that was all mostly crude oil, and in that situation, it's kind of rebounded quickly. The warmer waters promotes bacterial growth. Sunlight that comes into the area helps break down the crude oil too, so it does rebound pretty quickly from it, and sometimes better than what we expect. Refined oil is a different story and a different beast in its own, and sometimes naturally it just won't break down as quickly, disperse as quickly, and that'll take a lot longer for it naturally to clean up. Once again, this can be devastating marine life. We saw with Exxon, BP, a number of the incidents that we'll talk about in class. So what we can do for some of this coastal waters pollution as far as prevention. We could definitely recycle used oil. Double hulls for oil tankers, so if they do hit ground, we don't have to worry about it leaching out into the water or spilling out into water. Coastal development, if we regulate it, make sure there's not much going on there so that our watersheds and estuaries have that ability to basically take in any pollutants and break them down, they'll be fine. But if we keep developing, then those natural areas won't be there to protect us. Banning ocean dumping and separate sewage from storm lines, that's a big thing. So water runoff, water from rainfalls goes into sewers that directly discharge versus that are separate from sewage. And also this will reduce the impact on sewage treatment plants too. They'll be able to handle whatever sewage goes in better. Reduce input of toxic pollutants, some things that we can do. Oil, as far as cleanup, basically improving response is one of the biggest things that we can have those areas. Use of wetlands to help us do this. So basically maintaining those wetlands and estuaries will help clean up too. The key to reducing non-point pollution is that we see from agriculture is to prevent it from reaching bodies of water. So that's basically what we're going to be looking at, is either regulation on it or trying to improve the areas around those non-point sources of pollution. And what we can see here, we have buffer zones, feedlots away from steeply sloped land so that there's less runoff, and also keeping them away from surface water and flood zones. That will help. Now, we do see them in the Mississippi region, so when there's floods, we have issues with these feedlots and other agricultural areas. We in the United States and a number of other developed countries have very similar laws to what we have, the U.S. Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, that will kind of keep at bay a number of these contaminants that some other areas, developing countries, are dealing with. So it's there, that Clean Water Act, that kind of helps us a lot and helps keep industry and agriculture in check by requiring them to get any sort of polluters to get permits for any discharge that they may have. One thing that we also, that's relatively new here on Long Island and in a number of different areas, the movement from cesspools to either sewage treatment plants or septic systems. Now you can see with the septic system, and we'll talk definitely more about this in class. Basically, you have your waste line from your house. Sludge will go to the bottom, where there we'll have bacteria that will break it down. Wastewater will go out into a field, a drainage field. Any scum floats to the top, is trapped, and then we have an access cover where we can remove some of that scum. Gases will also be able to escape throughout there too. So using bacteria that will help naturally break this down, and this kind of tiered system will help prevent any of the nitrates and phosphates from our waste to entering into our water supplies and allowing bacteria to break it down. Raw sewage reaching a municipal sewage treatment plant typically undergoes two different types of treatment, most of the time three different types of treatment. So we have primary, secondary, and tertiary depending on the plant. But in our primary sewage treatment plant, it's a physical process between a number of different screens and types of tanks, grit tanks. We can remove large floating objects that allow settling. And allows settling of waste, Secondary treatment is the biological process where bacteria breaks down our waste, and with the help of us pumping in oxygen, will basically break down our waste. So then at that point, you can go to tertiary treatment, where either it's undergone UV or chlorine, and then at that point, discharged into a body of water. And it looks a little bit like this. This schematic is pretty nice. So we have our raw sewage, basically what comes in your toilets in the house and any other water sources. Goes in, we have a bar screen. This will pull out, sometimes set up on a conveyor belt, pull out things like any sort of sanitary napkins, any other things that might have been put down into the toilet systems. And that's taken out, and that goes to a landfill. Then we have a grit chamber. Same thing. Any of the heavier stuff that was made by the bar screen will sink down to the bottom, and the same thing, that grit can also go off into a landfill. At this point, it now goes into a settling tank. So that sludge will go down to that tank and then make its way through a digester. And ultimately, this digester, these heavier stuff will go down to a drying bed or sometimes get compressed. That goes off to a landfill. The stuff that was floating goes through an aeration tank. Remember, this is bacterial. So what we do is we pump a huge amount of oxygen into that water to allow that bacteria the best available conditions to break down waste. We then will recycle some of that sludge back in, keeping that bacteria a nice healthy culture of bacteria. Once at that point, it goes to a settling tank. Once again, that heavier stuff that hasn't broken down goes to that digester and becomes a cake at some point, sludge cake, which can be used to help as fertilizer in some areas, or will go to an incinerator, a landfill, and then basically once we're past that settling tank, we go into our tertiary type treatment in some areas, kills any bacteria, then out to a river or a lake. So that's our typical system that we have, and we'll go over that a little bit more too in class. Our tertiary treatment, like I said, is we can remove certain contaminants from that system, and in that, so any nitrates and phosphates we want to remove, we could do that at the tertiary step too. Chlorination, huge part. Sometimes we either see that in secondary or tertiary treatment. That's to disinfect and kill any bacteria and viruses that are not water. Sewage and soil can be used for another things, like I mentioned. We can use it as amendment to soils to grow things. We just want to make sure there's no bacteria or toxic chemicals in it. That's one thing. But it is available. Some areas will use those sludge cakes because at that point they know it's relatively clean or free from any contaminants to enrich soils. This is just looking at a number of different things that can get into our water supplies and then out into our oceans. So this groundwater contamination, pathogens may leak into an aquifer, which ultimately may connect up to a stream and then move out into our oceans. Sludge, same thing. This could be from a feedlot, make its way in, and these pathogens all can make their way into rivers and move out. So there's a number of different issues that we have to that were associated with sewage, feedlots, basically any sort of human or animal waste. So what we can do, one of the best things we could do is have natural and artificial wetlands. Wetlands, plants will pull contaminants out. Also, they'll help break down any waste. And if we can have these areas set up strategically around either feedlots or sewage treatment plants, it'll make sure that that water is relatively clean as it gets out into oceans or through any watersheds. Water pollution significantly has improved, has decreased over the time due to laws such as the Clean Water Act that basically either permit people or any polluters or just make sure the standards for our water are as high as they possibly can be. Drinking water quality, there's a number of things between the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, that basically has allowed our water to be some of the cleanest in the world, despite the amount of industry that's going on around it. So these laws just keep, like I said, help us protect and protect our water supply. So the overall, UN estimates that about 6 million Americans drink water that does not meet EPA standards. And some of these, now both these laws, the Environmental Protection Agency basically has the regulation or the ability to enforce them along with state governments too. So we still, despite these laws, have issues with that, and we need to work with industry and these laws to kind of make sure that our water supply is clean. Some people believe bottled water is the answer, but there are issues with that too. Typically, bottled water companies will pump their water from the same aquifers where we get our water from. And also the plastics themselves are made from fossil fuels and may leach into our bottled water also. So it's not necessarily the answer. So some solutions to water pollution, basically reducing any of our non-point-and-point sources of pollution. Air pollution, once again, can bring pollution down into bodies of water. Reducing poverty, reducing birth rates, basically reducing birth rates will cause less of a demand on our water supplies. Work with nature to treat sewage with those natural and artificial wetlands are some of the things that we can do. What you can do, growing or buying organic foods that aren't using fertilizers, composting your food waste, composting toilets, minimize use of pesticides, are a number of things that you can do to make sure that any systems that we have naturally or through municipal systems are not being overtaxed. And that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this screencast. Take care.